Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 1st of October, and in today's iteration of the Patriot Perspective, I want to look at an extremely topical issue, that being the potential for another round of conflict between Israel, Iran, and potential United States involvement. I want to go through the context and the background leading up to this potential conflict. I want to go back to 2015 and discuss the initial enactment of the JCPOA, how it's about to expire now, and what that means for the region, looking at the details of Israeli and American military capabilities, especially their air defense assets, of course, the Iranian ballistic missile arsenal. So let's get into this. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to begin with just a brief reminder of everything that occurred since 2015. So we know that obviously Ahmadinejad, he was the president of Iran during the early 2000s up until I think it was 2013. And that's when we really saw the blossoming for the first time of Iran's nuclear program. That's when a lot of these facilities were first set up and the first generation of centrifuges were also installed. And that's when we started to see UN sanctions form. And that was during the Bush administration, if you recall. There were at least six major sanction packages passed by the UN, meaning that they were legally binding for UN member states, and of which there are 193. And that included a lot of impositions of sanctions, including some arms embargoes, restrictions on dealing with nuclear energy, and then sending Ukraine, or sorry, not Ukraine, but Iran spare parts and technological material and such. So there were restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, even the civilian one in this case. There were frozen assets, travel bans on certain figures, and more generally targeting of some shipping lanes and bank networks, but not most of Iran's financial nucleus. The UN sanctions, which they stopped in around 2015. That's when the final one was passed. But those UN administered sanctions, they were more so military related and meant to specifically curb the nuclear program rather than targeting Iran's economy as a whole. But regardless, that's when the initial conflict started, and Obama got into office, of course, in 2009. Obama, he was able to negotiate with the new president after Ahmadinejad was replaced, and you had Rouhani take over. Rouhani being more of a reformist than Ahmadinejad. He was one of the hardliners, more conservative in his outlook on foreign relations, and he was far more anti-Western and simply unwilling to discuss terms with the West, but Rouhani was able to, and so was his foreign minister. And so they are the ones that, of course, negotiated with John Kerry, who at the time was, I believe, Secretary of State, and they brokered the Iran nuclear deal. The United States did this in conjunction with the E3, meaning three major EU nations at the time. Of course, the UK is no longer in the EU, but it included the UK, France, and Germany. So those three plus Russia and China, they all agreed to this nuclear arrangement where Iran would only be able to enrich their uranium to 3.67%, which nominally should be enough for a civilian nuclear program. And moreover, they were required to allow IAEA inspections. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, they would have complete access and they would be very strict. They would have the ability to go in and look at all of the various centrifuges and verify the information in order to ensure that Iran was not violating the terms of the agreement. Now, in return, there would be a moratorium on those six UN administered sanctions that have passed over the past, say, 12 years before the nuclear deal was finally completed in 2015. So all of the signatories and all of the UN member states as well, they would no longer be required to levy those sanctions on Iran. And then the United States lifted the sanctions that they imposed, strictest ones. Same thing when it comes to Europe. And so that naturally did in 2015 improve the Iranian economy. It led to a lot of assets that had previously been frozen finally being returned to them. So again, improvement when it comes to the real, improvement in the stock markets, and more generally reduction in unemployment, inflation, and such for that time period. But it was a very short window, of course, because we all know that in 2018, Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. I think that was in May of 2018. And then he reinstituted the harshest sanctions, meaning that the US has, say, the heaviest and the most heavy-handed approach to the sanctions regimen, even compared to the E3 countries and the EU now. But we'll look at their new sanctions protocol in a moment that was just released on September 29th. But the US, they led the way when it comes to leaving the agreement and claiming that it was pointless. Now, in 2019, that's when the IAEA for the first time claimed that Iran was in a violation of the agreement and that they were, of course, producing uranium enrichment at levels that were not consistent with civilian levels and more than the 3.67%. By 2020, 2021, when Biden came into office, the numbers were steadily rising. So 20%, 30%, and such. And Biden did attempt at the beginning of the administration in 2021 and 2022 to get back to the negotiating table, but really was unable to make any headway in doing so. And as a result, especially by 2023, when October 7th started, there was just a complete pause and halting in any sort of diplomatic initiative. As a result, you did have just a couple of agreements, smaller ones between the US and Iran in relation to freezing some assets in return for some American prisoners that were held in Iran, but that's about it. Now Trump comes into office 2025 and he hands ultimatum to the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. He says that they have 60 days to negotiate a new arrangement and that if the diplomatic avenue does not work, that there has to be a solution military wise. So he, has the carrot and stick approach. That was essentially Trump's angle with this. Khamenei lets the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, who was a reformist, he was elected in 2024. He lets him begin the negotiations with the foreign minister, Arakchi. And it's important to note that, you had the reformist Rouhani in office until 2021. Then this extremely hardline conservative, Raisi, takes over as Iran's president, and he dies in this very mysterious helicopter crash in 2024. And he died, it was like in the northwestern part of Iran, pretty close to Azerbaijan, actually. And then from there, the reformist candidate once again wins, this time Pezeshkian, and he beat the hardliner, say, Jalili, who we may talk about him in the future, maybe not in this video, but he is an important figure now within Iran. But in any case, they begin the negotiations in Muscat, the capital of Oman, and also I think at some point in Rome. At some points, there were proposals by Witkoff that may have had some headway, but eventually stalled. And so there clearly was no way for a deal to continue advancing. And by the 60-day mark, Trump was very firm on those 60 days. Afterwards, he was not willing to continue with the negotiations. And only 2 days afterwards, after that 60-day period ended, and I think it started in like March or April, probably April. So it lasted all of April and May and then expired by mid-June. So the Israelis, on the night of June 12th, they launch this heavy aerial assault on Iran. And we'll just go through it very quickly. I could talk about it forever, but let's just give a very brief summary. Over 30 high-ranking Iranian military officials are killed, especially during the opening salvo, but then in the successive 12 days, many more were also killed. Over 17 of Iran's top nuclear scientists killed during the course of the fighting, during the course of the Israeli bombing, obviously, and a lot of assassinations on those individuals. Strikes that were part of the suppression of enemy air defense campaign. So a lot of Iran's air defense systems were neutered initially, and that gave the Israeli Air Force the freedom of operation needed to move from northwestern Iran near Tabriz in the Urmia Lake all the way southeastwards towards Tehran. And then by the end of the 12-day war, they were already striking the heart of the capital, doing so without any resistance from air defense systems, and in the process, of course, targeting Iran's internal security force. Moreover, they struck Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, striking underground storage facilities and silos, but also above ground TELs that were planning to launch rockets and, of course, ballistic missiles in this case into Israel itself. And that's one of the big reasons why Israel did not incur as much damage as it perhaps could have. And so, again, major emphasis on striking the ballistic missile arsenal, targeting the planetary mixtures as well, and the entire supply chain production process for the missiles. And then, of course, the nuclear sites. So let's look at the map over here of the nuclear sites. We can see that the Israelis targeted the Arak heavy water reactor facility. I don't think it was in operation at the time, but regardless, they struck it. They struck the Parchin military complex on the Rhone, and several other nuclear sites within Tehran itself. Then the United States got involved for a single night, Operation Midnight Hammer, as we recall. They struck the Fordow site. That's the most famous target. But there was also, of course, the enrichment plant in Natanz and the Nuclear Technology Center in Isfahan. So, in Fordow, the damage was very significant. It's an area that's 60 to 90 meters deep, and underground, you have a lot of centrifuges, some of them being the most modern ones. There's a large stockpile of highly enriched uranium. That means that's getting very close to the 90% needed for nuclear grade weapons material. But at the time, I would say that it was probably at 60%. Most of that highly enriched uranium, about 400 kilograms of it exists, according to Lindsey Graham and all these other officials from both sides, even on the Iranian end, claiming that 400 kilograms exist, and that for the most part it's buried under the mountains in Fordow after the American strike. And since the strikes occurred in June, there's not been an attempt yet by the Iranians to salvage what they have over there. So for the time being, they've not made an effort to try to retrieve the uranium, but it's still there. We don't know whether it's fully intact or whether it was completely destroyed due to the shock wave and all of the infrastructure nearby collapsing. That's a good question, but nobody has the answer to it. The U.S. assessment, though, is that they caused extreme damage, but I would posit that it's not completely destroyed. Isfahan is very important because there's an underground component to it that is like 150 meters underground, and it wasn't even struck, it wasn't even touched by the American strikes because it would be impossible to penetrate that deep, meaning that all of the centrifuges and all of the stocks of uranium that may have been here actually did survive, and there's no question about it. In Natanz, the damage was very significant, again, above ground especially, but also underground. And so that's an area where there was a lot of success. Near Fordow, even before this happened, there was an attempt to build a new, even deeper facility for enrichment and to store the uranium. And that would be called Pickaxe Mountain. So it's not completed yet, but I think it would be over 100 meters deep, maybe even 150 meters deep, right under this massive mountain that could absorb the strike from any sort of potential bombing run in the future. So it's not completed yet, but it's a plan for the Iranians now, and they understand that they need to ensure that their underground sites are strike proof. So that's one reason why there is still concern about the Iranian nuclear program, because that Pickaxe Mountain, which is very close to the original Fordow sites, is in the process of being built, although it's not completed by any means. Moreover, Iran and Russia just signed a $25 billion nuclear plant deal, and this is going to be built in Sirik, which is this like city in southern Iran. I don't know if I'll be able to find it off the top of my head, but it's like somewhere over here in southern Iran, very close to the coastline of UAE and Oman. So yeah, you can see it over here. I found it. Sirik's over here. They're gonna build four new power plants over there, and it's gonna be done by the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom, and they'll have a total capacity of 5 gigawatts. So again, that's going to be again an up jettisoning of the Iranian nuclear program. Very important to keep an eye out for that initiative, but it is long term. Right now, what's going on? Well, there was an option for the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table after the war ended. That was the hope of some European nations and maybe even Trump. But again, within certain like frameworks, because there are certain red lines that the U.S. has that they don't want to cross when it comes to what they're willing to concede on in negotiations with Iran. Now, the Iranians, they've been far more hesitant to agree to negotiations after the negotiating party, the United States, obviously bombed them and bombed their nuclear sites. But regardless, there was a fear that the E3 countries would introduce the snapback sanction mechanism back, and that would have major ramifications for the Iranian economy and diplomatic situation. So, what is the snapback sanction mechanism? Well, in the Iran deal, there is this term that states that if any one of the signatories, and we talked about which ones there are the three European nations, there's Russia, China, and then there's America. So if any one of them sees that the Iranians are not abiding by the terms of the deal, then they hand the UN a notice about that. And then there's a 1 month period where that can be resolved. And after that 1 month period, the UN votes on whether to continue sanctions relief. And if that fails, if that initiative fails, then the sanctions from the UN package, the original six UN sanctions that were, placed on a moratorium, they come back, and then it's legally binding for all of the UN member states, the 193 of them, to impose those sanctions back on Iran. And then you guys may ask, what happens when the deal expires? Well, those six sanctions would become permanent, and it would be far more difficult to remove them out after the nuclear deal is over. So what happened? Well, in late August, those three European nations, they announced that they were going to, send the UN a notification about Iran not abiding by the deals. Iran tried to salvage the situation by bringing the IAEA back after they expelled them in June, and they met with Rafael Grossi, who was the head of the agency, and they led them into the non-damaged nuclear sites in Iran, of which there are not many, but one of them being Bushehr, which is this one that's very close to the coast, and that's probably part of why it was not targeted during the war. There could also have been some sort of nuclear fallouts if it was targeted. It's very dangerous for nearby countries as well. But that's an area that was not really touched during the course of the fighting over there. So they were let into those inspection areas, but not into the three damaged facilities like Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. That was one initiative. There were attempts to reestablish communication in Doha between the E3 countries and Iran, but it fell flat on its ears. And then the three European nations, UK, Germany, and France, announced to the UN that they were going to, bring back the snapback mechanism. A month passed on September 27th, and the votes to continue relief failed 4-11 in the United Nations Security Council. Beforehand, there was an effort by Russia and China to extend the sanctions relief for another 6 months. Again, it failed. And so, yeah, the sanctions are now back on, meaning that those six sanctions and the six sanctions very quickly, they include an arms embargo for many important military related products, aircraft, tanks, ballistic missiles, any sort of material that could be related to the nuclear program as well. There are sanctions on some financial institutions, some individuals linked to the IRGC. There are certain frozen assets that come into play. So that's a large part of the sanctions regimen. It's not necessarily targeting the backbone of the Iranian economy. There's not a restriction on oil or gas, but there are inspections that are required on Iranian ships if there is a fear that there's dual use transportation of military equipment. So all of that now has come into place. But there is still one final window, an opportunity of hope for Iran, and that would be that the nuclear deal expires on October 18th of this year, 10 years after it was initially put into place. So between today, the 1st of October, and the 18th of October, there's still an opportunity for there to be a, repealing of the snapback mechanism, and there could be a chance that it gets removed, but only if the Iranians make some sort of compromise with the European countries, and they're able to convince them that they're not violating the deal anymore. And let's say that doesn't happen. If that does not happen, then the six UN sanctions are finalized, as going to be far more difficult to get them removed in the future. Now, the Iranians, some of them claim that this is a pretty big deal, but others claim that it's not because they've already been sanctioned by the US since 2018, which caused a lot of economic difficulties. And regardless of whether there are sanctions or not, China and Russia will not abide by them. That's much is pretty obvious. They're not going to stop their business dealings with Iran or even their military ones due to the UN resolution. There's always going to be some sort of loophole for them, but they're not going to be obligated by an international treaty into stopping it. And so we all know that the Russians reportedly sent MiG-29s to the Iranians very recently to their Shiraz airbase, Shiraz being a major city in southern Iran over here. So they deployed MiG-29s to this area. Iran is trying to acquire the S-400 air defense missiles, which will be important if there's another round of fighting with Israel. They're trying to get the HQ-9 interceptors and air defense systems from China. And the long-term goal would be to get the Su-35 fighter jets from Russia. That's long been in the works, that plan to receive Su-35s. But in the meantime, until it arrives, the Russians are sending in as a stopgap measure MiG-29s. Again, pretty old system. It's not really going to change anything on the battlefield. Iran already has MiG-29s, and they did very little to change anything when it comes to the 12-day war. For the most part, they were all hidden. And the ones that weren't hidden, they were targeted by Israel, or some MiGs may have tried to engage with the drones. That's about it. Like, very minimal impact on the course of the fighting. So that's what is important when it comes to the sanctions regimen. The EU, they introduced their own sanctions measures, and you can see them over here: travel bans, assets frozen, economic and financial sanctions, arms export ban, and everything related to enrichment related activities in ballistic missile program, the financial sector, the Central Bank of Iran, and major commercial banks being restricted. Again, preventing access to EU airports for Iranian cargo flights. Very important sanctions, especially the financial aspect, because again, it's not like Iran was doing many military dealings with these countries, but there may have been some financial dealings. And as a result, we can look at the stock exchange over here, or not the stock exchange, but at the currency exchange. And since the snapback mechanism came into place on the 27th, there's been a pretty significant rise in the value of the US dollar in comparison to the rial. So once again, the rial, the Iranian currency, is getting devalued. You can see over here that compared to a week ago, there's been a 7.5% increase in the exchange rate. And over the past 6 months, it's been a 12% increase. So again, rather significant numbers. What are the current sort of major problems facing Iran from an internal standpoint? First of all, inflation is at 40%, unemployment is at 9%, and the youth unemployment is between 15 to 20%. That is extremely high and leads to a lot of frustration with the younger Iranians, obviously. So that's a concern. Droughts right now are a pretty big problem. You can look at Google Maps over here, Lake Urmia over here in northwestern Iran. Used to be really, really just full of water, just an amazing bastion of water. But now it's largely dried up. It's only like half a meter in depth at this point. It's just largely been evaporated. So that's a consequence of the drought. And some of it is due to rising temperatures. Other consequences are due to the massive overconsumption by Iranian agriculture. Iranian agriculture accounts for 90% of Iran's water consumption, which is a crazy number when you think about it, but it only contributes to about 10% of Iran's GDP. So that's where you have to think, like, shouldn't Iran be more reliant on, imports from other countries for their agriculture rather than wasting all their money on creating their own? But that's the problem. They're getting locked out of the global financial system by the United States and by the European nations. So that's a part of why there is this problem. But obviously, it's not ubiquitous because they have dealings with China. You know, Iran's sort of largest importer of energy and gas is China, and then there are other countries nearby like the UAE, Turkey, India, and such. They're also bringing in Iranian oil and gas. So they're involved in all this. Energy wise, again, energy prices are rising, and that's crazy when you think about it because Iran has some of the largest stockpiles of energy reserves, oil and natural gas in the entire world. But because of corruption, because of sanctions, because of an old and decaying energy grid, they are currently dealing with rolling blackouts. They are trying to conserve water because they don't have enough. Their government agencies are shutting off sprinklers for their gardening, for their sort of grass on their lawns. They are doing rolling blackouts during the day, and sometimes it's not rolling blackouts. Sometimes it's spontaneous and it can't be controlled. So there's a massive issue when it comes to the energy consumption, and the consumption rates for civilians are not going down despite the requests from the government. So those are just some of the issues at a very cursory glance, and it's all contributing to the poor financial situation, which could explode in case of a war. When you think about it, if there's any attempt by the Israelis to target any of the power grid, any of the oil storage facilities, that would at that point become an economic crisis for the Iranians, and then we'd have to ask ourselves what's going to happen in terms of internal stability. But now, when it comes to why there may be a war, I'm going to, again, keep this very short. The U.S. is moving the USS Gerald R. Ford across the Strait of Gibraltar towards the Middle East through the Mediterranean Sea. That's something that is pretty interesting. It's the largest aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, and it's being redirected towards Israel. Another important thing to note is that since the 12-day war ended, the U.S. has sent in even more air defenses to beef up the Israeli supply. So in this area over here, generally, there were around 6 THAAD launchers deployed, and a THAAD battery consists of 6 launchers. So there was one battery, and during the war, there may have been 2 at most, but then one of them was withdrawn. And then once the war ended, a couple of weeks later, they sent back four new launchers. So now they're Trend THAAD launchers in Israel, and they're administered by the Americans. They have like 100 or 200 soldiers that are administering them. And that's important because each battery consists of 48 of these interceptor missiles at a minimum. They may have even more if depending on whether they actually have the reserves. And that's another conversation. It's very important. But at a minimum, they have those 48. And if we're looking at each individual launcher, each one has eight launchers. So we're looking at 80 minimum that can be used to intercept some of the highest quality, higher end Iranian missiles. Moreover, we know that during the course of the war, during the course of the 12-day war, the United States depleted 25% of its entire THAAD stockpile, which is massive. They had probably like 600 at first before the war started, and between 100 to 150 were depleted during the course of the fighting due to the fact that they were fired and intercepted a lot of the Iranian missiles. And that accounted for about half of the interceptions that accrued by the Israelis and the Americans. So that's in addition to all of the other ways in which the U.S. intercepted missiles, whether it be the fact that they used the Aegis defense system, which is what's used by the Navy, so the SM-3s or the SM-6s, or the Israeli side using the Arrow 2s or 3s, using sometimes David Sling, although that's not preferable, and then also utilizing the Iron Dome when they were very low on supplies, very low on the Arrow stockpile. You can see over here how the THAAD is sort of shorter range compared to the SM-3 and SM-6. Those ones can go into the past atmosphere and they have maximum distances of 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. So just totally different ballgame. But over here, looking at the Israeli systems, they have the Arrow 3, David Sling, Iron Dome, and you could see all of their ranges over here on this very useful infographic provided by CNN. There's not a lot of procurement for THAADs. If they use up 100 of them, they're only going to get 37 back next year. So what's going on? They're not going to be replaced by producing more of them if a war starts now. So that means the United States is going to have to pull more THAADs from their dwindling stockpile from other countries, whether it be in Europe or from Saudi Arabia or from South Korea. And so they're going to weaken their footprint of THAADs all across the world only to concentrate on the potential war in Iran. So that's another thing the United States has to consider in whether they want to allow Israel or whether they want to help Israel in case another war breaks out. What's going to happen with their THAAD interceptors? Will they be able to withstand another grueling campaign and another sort of daily efforts of intercepting dozens or even more ballistic missiles? And so that's something we have to keep in mind. Combined together, if we add in all the Israeli interceptors, all the American ones, I would estimate they have like 700 to 1,000 that can be used in earnest to defend against the Iranian assaults in a new war if it were to start around now, you could say. And that would probably be enough for another 12-day war if the war ends in about 2 weeks. But after that point, it would really dwindle, and there would have to be tough decisions made about which missiles are allowed to fall through the air defense sort of umbrella and which ones are not. And unfortunately, what happens is once there's an overload, the military sites are the ones that are the most protected, but the civilian areas, they won't receive the same level of coverage. Now, on the Iranian side, what do they have to offer? Well, their means of exerting any sort of pressure on Israel is through the ballistic missile arsenal at this point. So before the 12-day war started, it was estimated they had around 3,000 ballistic missiles that can reach Israel, and those would be the intermediate range ballistic missiles. And they have a range of between 1,500 to 2,500 within the context of reaching from Iran to Israel. That number, I think, is realistic. Some would say that it's a bit on the lower end and that they think that likely Iran had even more, but there's just simply not enough evidence to work with. I do believe that they certainly had way more cruise and ballistic missiles that cannot reach Israel, but simply they have in their inventory. But that's not much, that's not of any utility to Iran unless they want to attack any other country or any other American base in the Middle East. Within the context of targeting Israel specifically, they probably only have 3,000 ballistic missiles, and they used up 557 of them on the actual firing of them, like actually firing the ballistic missiles into Israel. And moreover, it's estimated that around 1,000 of them were destroyed within their own territory. So you're adding it up, and it's about 1,500. Now, of course, estimates can be wrong, and there's a certain level of leeway that we can provide. But what that would imply generally is that they have about 1,500 left that can be used in a future conflict. And those are being stored in underground missile facilities, in these silos under the mountains, in the Zagros Mountains, for instance, over here in the southeastern range or in the north as well. And a lot of them were targeted during the war with Israel. But what Israel was able to do is just neuter them for the course of the war. But once the war ended, the Iranians were able to just go in and create a hole and an opening in the facility and then extract whatever they need. And that's a more systematic issue. But it is something that is still concerning for the Iranians because as long as Israel has aerial superiority, Iran can't really fire major salvos of their ballistic missiles all at once to overwhelm the Israeli air defense and American air defense array. So even if they do have an abundant stockpile in the here and now, in the actual moment where it matters, they may not be able to use them all in abundance. And then it becomes a dripping sort of war where they just drip out very small salvos. And then each one gets individually absorbed. Some get destroyed before they can even get fired. During the war, the most recent war, the Israelis were able to destroy dozens of TELs, meaning the launchers for the missiles, while they were preparing, while they were primed to fire into Israel. And so perhaps they had 500 TELs before the war. They lost between 200 to 300 of them due to the Israeli strikes. That's the Israeli assessment. Maybe it's wrong, maybe it's exaggerated, but that's what we're working based off of. We don't have any sort of like independent way of getting a full gauge of the situation. If we look at video footage, like the video footage posted amounts to like 50 TELs that were destroyed. But obviously, they're not going to release every single piece of footage showing every single TL that they ever destroyed. But it is a good baseline, of course. And so, yeah, we're at a crash course over here because Iran, they won't have much to lose if the sanctions remain on them and they don't get repealed. Once the Iran nuclear deal ends on the 18th of October, they're already trying to sort of double down on the relationship with China and Russia and trying to really very quickly restore their military capabilities to ensure that they can better defend in a new conflict with Israel. And then long term, they're looking at just creating an even more expansive nuclear program in spite of the concerns of the Israelis and the Americans and Europeans. And then on the Israeli side, Israel wants to maintain its strategic edge over Iran that it was able to achieve in the first war, meaning they're going to be very trigger happy to, restart confrontations if they see that that the gap between them is getting closer and closer, and that some of the missile production is returning, new weapon systems from Russia and China are coming in. Like they don't like that idea of Iran being able to close the gap again. And so they're going to be willing to start preemptive operations. The only thing that will stop them is one, if there's some sort of like pressure from America and saying that, okay, we're going to try to negotiate again, but that's very unlikely right now. The other main reason why they're hesitant to do so is because they may be running low on interceptors and they need to produce or bring in as many from other countries as they can before they restart a war. So I think that's the only reason why a war is not started yet. And I think once that situation gets resolved, once Israel feels that it has enough interceptors to actually absorb an attack from Iran, that's when they're going to strike because they don't want Iran to be given the time that it currently has in order to restore its capabilities. And it's going to be important to see whether Israel goes for the jugular, tries to conduct a decapitation of the entire government, or whether it's just an effort to take out, say, the new military capabilities or destroy all of the nuclear sites, whether they want to destroy the Iranian economy. There are a lot of options, and all of that stems from the fact that they have aerial superiority, but they won't have it if the sort of timeline goes forward a couple of years, and then Iran can receive all these new systems from China and Russia. And that's why Israel wants to attack now, while they still have that aerial superiority over much of Western Iran, for instance. And then from there, they can launch air-launched ballistic missiles deeper into the country, and it doesn't even matter that they don't have jets flying over the central parts of the country. That only happens in very rare occasions. And so, yeah, that's generally what's going on over here. I don't think that it's going to happen like right now, meaning October, but it's certainly something that will be raised. The consequences or the likelihood of it happening will rise even further if nothing happens in relation to the snapback sanctions before the expiration date on the 18th of October. So, certainly something to look out for. And it's certainly something to keep in mind when we look at the constant meetings between the Prime Minister of Israel and Donald Trump, looking at the meetings between CENTCOM, Central Regional Command in the United States, and Israeli military officials like the Chief of Staff. That's going to be the way that we have an indication of what they're planning. And the fact that they're moving in the USS Gerald Ford, they're moving in THAADs once again, they're moving in and rotating tankers and fighter jets in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. all of it grants credence, it lends credence to the idea that there are preparations underway. Doesn't mean it's imminent, but it means that it's a major possibility and that it's planned at some point in the not so distant future. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and see you guys later.